It's time to look at air traffic control. Air traffic control is abbreviated ATC, which is obvious. Here's some air traffic controllers. This picture is a little misleading because generally they do not rely on flight. But air traffic control is a system, has a purpose to prevent collisions between aircraft. Pretty obvious. And it is part of the U.S. federal government organization. And it's the specific branch of government is the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. So those two pieces, pretty significant. How did air traffic control start? Well, it started because early aviators depended on visual references. They looked around to see where they were going to fly, and they said, I recognize that tree, so I'm going to fly over there because that's where I live. So airports began using flagmen in the 20s to say, hey, you land, you circle around, whatever it is. And there were very few planes in the sky, so not that big of an issue until the Air Commerce Act in 1926 established the United States rules. And that was because there was more and more planes, still very few, but more and more planes flying. And they started running into each other, save me, in midair. So air traffic control began in 1958 after they were tired of planes running into each other. The air traffic control system is based on these upside down wedding cake type things. And it's divided into three-dimensional areas called classes. You have A through G. So DIA is going to have the highest level of restricted airspace. But if you look at this, above the airport is when you're at this altitude, this looks like around here in this little example, it's around 700 feet above ground level, AGL. You can't be in this area. But as you get higher and higher up, that branches out because planes are going to be descending into this area. They're going to be flying down like this, and then landing down here. So that's why this thing widens out as you get to larger airports. And again, it looks like an upside down wedding cake. Here comes bride. Airports are connected by federal airways called Victor Airways and jet routes. And these are just lines that are kind of predefined like highways in the sky. And so airplanes will generally follow those flight paths, those routes. And they do that for safety reasons. In case something happens along the way, then they kind of have a plan as to where they were flying. And they know where to look if they're looking for a crash. You're like this blue line, and you can see it says V24, so that would be Victor Airway 24 something. We can't read the bottom of that. So these blue lines that you would see on here are Victor Airways. The traffic pattern defines routes to approach and departure from each airport, and it's based on 5 main legs. So you have the downwind, the base, final departure, and crosswind. Now, I want to take a look at this really quick with you. We have a departure leg, so we're looking at this. We're departing, depart, and then we turn, and then at that point, probably start to get into your flight path. Now, if you're approaching, you have a downwind leg, and then we turn, and then we do our final approach in. You might think that you are going to land and take off with the wind because you're thinking extra wind is helping you. It's actually opposite. You are always going to land and take off against the wind because you have air flowing against the airfoil. That's air. And so that gives you extra airflow over the airfoil, which increases your lift, as we learned, because how airfoils create lift. So you want to always take off against the wind. You also want to land against the wind because you can do it at slower speeds because that wind is hitting you, providing more lift, even though you're going slower. So it's easier to control. So runways typically are built in the direction of the wind, parallel to the most predominant winds. And if there's shifting winds, that's when you'll see runways that cross, that kind of intersect, or sometimes they cross at like a T because if winds change, then they can just say, hey, we're going to use this runway predominantly now just based off the winds. And right now we're going to take a listen in on some real flight radio talk.
Cessna 550 off Mike, Centennial Tower, runway 17 left, line up and wait.
Runway 17 left, 0 off Mike.
Taking November 6 Charlie Juliet, heading 140, contact number departure, good day.
Departure, have a good one, 6 Charlie Juliet.
43 Lima, transponder appears inoperative.
That was pretty exciting, wasn't it? That was live on the day that I recorded it. Air traffic control system, they have to abide by a set of rules, which is good. For specific conditions, it's visual flight rules. If you have smaller aircraft that are flying at lower altitude, they can use visual flight rules oftentimes. But when visual flight is restricted, maybe by weather or cloud cover, then they have to be able to fly using instrument flight rules. All of your large aircraft, 747s, passenger aircraft, have to be able to fly by instrument flight rules. They're not just flying by sight because they're so high up, and they need to be able to fly at night also when they can't see anything, so use instruments for that. So visual flight rules generally for lower altitude, smaller personal aircraft type things, but most of these will also have instrument flight capability and be able to fly with instrument flight rules. If conditions do not allow them to fly IFR and they don't have that equipment, then it is illegal for them to fly. They cannot fly. So these are standards developed by the U.S. and they're used worldwide. Isn't that amazing? They have same procedures, equipment, and so on. U.S. developed it because the U.S. was the first to kind of have a large set of planes. They developed these rules, and the rest of the world said, yeah, those sound good, we'll use them. As a result, these flight rules are in the English language because everyone kind of uses the same terminology. Air traffic controllers often do not see the airplanes. They have to use radar to be able to see it. So they have a command center, there's coordinates for the air traffic for the nation, and they direct aircraft to speed up or to slow down to balance air traffic. There's some really fun little games, iPad games and things like that, where you're an air traffic controller. You have to direct where the planes have to fly, how they're going to land so they don't all crash into each other. That's actually what they do in real life, but it's not a game. You're going to do that in the next exercise. So here's some neat little air traffic controllers. This person is looking out the window. There's a bird out there, or maybe a plane, or maybe it's Superman. The air traffic control system is part of the FAA with the purpose to prevent collisions. Again, we've stated that before. It has a long history of development. So what's next? There are some new things coming up. It's called NextGen, and that's what this next little video is that you're going to watch.
America's antiquated air traffic control system is getting an upgrade. The overhaul is designed to keep up with increasing air travel and the push for on-time flights. But Ben Tracy shows us how parts of the country, including the area hosting this year's Super Bowl, are paying a steep price for progress.
And this is now our sleeping cave.
Nicole Marquez just moved her bedroom into the middle of her house and put plexiglass on all of her windows. She lives in Phoenix, so it's not to keep the heat in, but rather to keep the sound out.
If you can imagine yourself at an air show, that's what it would sound like.
Except you live at the air show.
I live at the air show.
She says there is now a constant barrage of airplanes flying over her home in this historic neighborhood near downtown Phoenix. Every 30 seconds for hours at a time.
You're gonna rip your hair out. 6 o'clock in the evening, you're ripping your hair out trying to eat dinner. Am I angry? Absolutely. I'm furious.
This is the unintended consequence of the FAA's Next Generation Air Transportation System, known as NextGen. It uses satellites instead of old-fashioned radar to guide airplanes. This allows for more planes in the air, safely spaced closer together, and burning less fuel because their flight paths are more direct. But in Phoenix, that change means planes that used to take off and turn 9 miles out now make that turn at 2 to 3 miles, flying low over heavily populated neighborhoods. Noise complaints have taken off too, soaring from 221 in all of 2013 to more than 3,300 in just the past 4 months since the flight paths were changed.
So for those neighborhoods, they got hammered by this change.
Greg Stanton is the mayor of Phoenix. He says the FAA did not hold a single public hearing notifying neighbors of the change, nor did the agency ever meet with him. The FAA says it did notify the airport as far back as 2012.
Do you feel like you were blindsided by the FAA?
Yes. I think that the choice that was made to have such a disproportionate impact over such a small number of people is really fundamentally unfair and unacceptable.
Have you since found out why the FAA did what they did?
No, this is still a mystery to us.
Turns out the FAA can do what it wants because it has a big backer, Congress. A 2012 congressional FAA authorization bill fast-tracked the rollout of NextGen by exempting it from normal environmental impact reviews and public hearings. The FAA declined our request for an interview.
It's the Federal Aviation Administration, not the Federal Arrogance Administration.
New York Congressman Steve Israel says NextGen is also causing problems for people in the Northeast, as flight paths at JFK and LaGuardia airports are also changing. He wants the FAA to start meeting with homeowners as it rolls out NextGen across the country through 2025.
I'm not asking for NextGen to be rolled back. I'm not asking for it to be reduced. I'm asking for the FAA to be sensitive to community concerns and ensure that not one community bears the noise, but that there's a fair and common sense distribution in the vicinity of airports.
Nicole Marquez says NextGen may be good for the country and the airline industry, but the pain should be shared.
I don't think that the airlines should be able to bank on other people's misery.
For CBS This Morning, Ben Tracy, Phoenix.
Boy, that's tough because you don't love that sound, especially like 6 o'clock in the morning if your plane taken off above your head.
It's interesting, my opinion changed in the middle of the story because I'm thinking, but Nicole, you bought near the airport, but it's different when they change the rules.
And they changed the flight path,
Surely
indeed.
they can work something out.
So as you can see, NextGen does not come with a perfect solution because while it does provide perfect landing routes and perfect departures and maybe more fuel efficiency, it does not allow for the increased noise over cities because of original predefined flight plans. So noise pollution is a real cause for concern.